Perfect. Can everyone see our screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, gentlemen. So I am Jacob Foster. I am the Chief Strategy Officer for Visa.
And I am Cadet Vivian Chai. I am the Chief Risk Officer for Visa.
And you all today, as you may know, are serving as our board of directors. And so we're going to be presenting to you about how we ought to respond regarding our business in Russia to the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Exactly.
So just a brief overview is, as some of you might be familiar with, the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention says that no two countries with a McDonald's should ever go to war with each other. That is clearly not the case. And so we're now entering somewhat uncharted territory globally. And what that means for us, a financial services company that mainly offers consumer credit and has quite a lot of business in Russia, is we're going to now need to reconcile these really unforeseen and unprecedented events, which bring with them a lot of financial and moral hazard, with how we can kind of guide ourselves into a solution that is both ethical, moral, and does not impede our obligations to our shareholders or our consumers. So just a brief overview of kind of our proposed solution is we're going to highlight some of the legal concerns that we have with doing business in Russia that have just emerged due to both the nature of the war itself, potential actions of the Russian state, as well as obviously the American sanctions regime. We're going to talk about how this can impact our business, both our ethical obligations to our shareholders and our obligation to serve our function as a company and generate profit, as well as just some of the more practical concerns this war and the government in Russia and changes within the government of Russia could have on our business, as well as then addressing some of the broad ethical concerns that are going to impact any of our potential courses of action. And just to introduce our proposed solution is what we are going to be advocating for, if the board supports it, is going forwards, we will not unilaterally pull all business from Russia, but we will take every measure to comply with the American sanctions regime on Russia, as well as doing additional research to identify individuals who are consistent with what the American sanctions regime would be targeting, even if they themselves have not been identified by the sanctions regime, as well as providing some in-kind financial assistance to Ukraine, such as limited debt relief and stuff like that, to both satisfy kind of our moral obligations to the consumer base in both countries without having any unforeseen or particularly dangerous consequences that could come from broader, more dramatic actions, like trying to avoid complying with the sanctions regime or pulling our business out of Russia entirely. With that, I'm going to pass that over to Vivian to go over a little bit of our agenda and the legal concerns.
Right. So we'll go ahead and start with our legal concerns. So we're really looking at sanctions compliance, financial inclusion, and regulatory requirements. And so we really want to ensure that all the standards that have been set with the US in terms of the ongoing conflicts between Russia and Ukraine are met and satisfied by our company. And as the conflict becomes this ongoing issue and new sanctions are created or amended, we want to ensure that our company is constantly taking the appropriate actions required. And in terms of financial inclusion, we're looking at how withdrawing from Russia impacts not only the Russian government, but also the Russian citizens. So we want to ensure that everyone who would be impacted by the withdrawal from Russia is being accounted for. And then in terms of the company within the United States, we're really trying to look at how this would impact not only our shareholders, but also our employees within our company and everyone who uses our credit cards within the US. Any financial harm caused by remaining in Russia would also have a direct effect on all of our customers and consumers within the national state. So we want to make sure that we're looking at both sides of this. And in terms of regulatory requirements, we want to ensure that everything is still being met and that we're considering the relations and what Russia itself stands for. And so by any action that's taken on our end has to be met with both.
Perfect. So we're going to now review some of the kind of business concerns that are going to be affecting us going forwards in Russia. These have obvious implications to our moral obligations, particularly to our shareholders, but also to our consumers in Russia and Ukraine both. So broadly speaking, Russia has been a good source of business for us in the past. We have revenue of about $1.2 billion a year, just from fees and associated elements of offering consumer credit in Russia. And Russia has historically been a high growth market. So there's been about a sevenfold increase in consumer spending in Russia since the year 2000 to 2012. And while that growth has stagnated since the invasion of Crimea and some of the issues with the oil market, which has a major impact on Russia's economy in recent years, it's still a pretty sizable market for us. And we've strong incentives to remain in the market, at least somewhat. But there's going to be a lot of impacts on our business with the war going forwards, and has already begun to be felt since 2014. So one of the biggest factors is obviously the Russian government, which has both been becoming more restrictive over personal individual liberty, as well as the freedom of various corporations to do business there, especially since 2014, and especially since the beginning of Vladimir Putin's third term. If any of you are familiar with the recent Wall Street Journal reporter who was seized on what seemed to be trumped up charges of spying, it causes concern for any Western businesses seeking to do business there, to the security of our employees, as well as a recent increase in the mortality rate of Russian CEOs cause for concern for basically any business people trying to do business there. There's also been a growth of bribery within the Russian state, which makes it more challenging for us to do business given the norms that we try to operate under, and the predictability that the rule of law generally offers us. There's also concerns about Russia's increasing alignment with Chinese pay systems. So ever since Russia's been put in place under sanctions starting in 2014, but that were redoubled in 2022, the Russian market and financial services have been increasingly linked to China, even going so far as to have yuan denominated trades rather than dollar denominated trades in recent years for natural resources, which is obviously a threat to our business model of offering affordable credit, which is generally denominated in dollars. There's also concerns that how our business with Russian citizens is being affected by this war. Our primary consumers are individuals. We are not in the business of offering large amounts of credit to the Russian government or government entities. So we are not directly interacting with it when it comes to them being a consumer. Rather, we're interacting with Russian citizens. Obviously, the war has implicated many citizens in the American sanctions regime who wouldn't otherwise have been previously because of their involvement with the Russian defense industry, or businesses that are supporting the Russian defense industry. But the vast majority of Russian citizens are not under any specific American sanctions, and are often reliant on cheap consumer credit, not for any nefarious reasons, but for just being able to live their lives, or potentially even more noble reasons. For example, if you saw any of the information about the massive numbers of Russians trying to avoid the draft, or escape due to political opposition to the war, many of them were relying on cheap credit to be able to afford plane tickets or other means of escape that they might not be able to afford otherwise. And there's the final concern, which is that the sudden downturn in Russia's economy outside of the energy sector over the past year as a result of the war could raise concerns about people's ability to pay back credit, as well as broader concerns about the Russian government's controls on Western credit that could threaten our business model more broadly. So what this has done is, since the war has exacerbated an already worsening situation where the high rolling times of 2000 to 2012 were already coming to an end, have now been greatly exacerbated by new tensions, which threatens both our ability to predictably do business with Russia in a way that is safe for our employees, safe for our business, safe for our investments, putting both our capital at risk. But it doesn't alter the basic reality that the vast majority of people we do business with in Russia are not part of the war, are not connected to the war in any direct way, and wouldn't be implicated in any sort of American sanctions regime, and in fact may be relying on the availability of consumer credit and American dollars to be able to do activities that we would support from an ethical or moral perspective, such as protest or not be totally dependent on the Russian government and have those luxuries of free expression that often come with being able to afford to get out of the country if you need to.
So for our ethical framework, we really wanted to break it down into the following three: human rights, social responsibility, and then looking at the general framework that we want to approach the situation by. So starting with human rights, we want to think about the message that Russia is sending and what remaining in Russia would say for our company. And so the following are just some of the stances that they take that are more controversial and we think would have a great impact. And especially given our stance and what we personally believe in, we want to make sure that the message we're sending to our shareholders and to our consumers does not is not like related to what Russia stands for.
Yeah, so addressing kind of some of the concerns about social responsibility, there's going to be obviously implications for our shareholders, customers, and employees who all often view us as being a company that's ethical. Even aside from fiduciary responsibilities, employees want to work for a company that they see as doing right by its consumers. Customers want to feel safe that they can trust our brand. And shareholders generally want to feel that they're involved in companies that are not merely profitable, but don't make them feel uncomfortable, say, to acknowledge themselves as shareholders in it. So a lot of these aspects of social responsibility are doubly important to drill down on, given the fact that they're going to be called into question. So you may be aware many of our competitors, companies like Visa, have been withdrawing from the Russian market entirely. This puts us in a difficult position because we'll need to actually answer questions as to why we're advocating that we continue to do business in Russia. So we want to take the perspective that ethical business practices involves considering some of the potential outcomes and second-degree consequences. So as we alluded to before when we were reviewing some of the business aspects of it, the credit that we're offering Russian people is generally not going to support the government. So there's the kind of ethical concern that if we continue to provide Russian people with credit, we are making the pain and suffering from the war inflicted on the Russian people not be reduced, right? It's giving them some sort of lifeline where they are not as subject to deprivation, poverty, stuff like that, which would be consequences associated with the war. The reason why there'd be a potentially compelling reason to just try to inflict maximum economic damage on the Russian people as a whole, regardless of individual consequences, is that it might decrease their appetite for war. It might make the cost of war so unbearable that there is created political pressure on the Russian government that would cause Russia to break off its invasion of Ukraine. It's generally our view that Visa alone, nor any of our competitors, would be able to actually drive that pressure in our own right, and it would actually have a kind of double danger of strengthening arguments that the West has abandoned Russia, the West is targeting Russia overall, or other kind of Putin-esque arguments that the West is just engaging in a grand conspiracy to destroy Russian civilization or Russian culture. So there could be some foreseeable but deeply negative consequences to a total withdrawal that we think would make a total withdrawal unsatisfactory to the ethical concerns of our shareholders, customers, and employees, even in the context of our competitors withdrawing. It's also important that we maintain the actual practice to be ethical. So we pride ourselves on going to great lengths to avoid offering services to criminals and to taking steps to verify that people are who they claim to be. These are normal ethical business practices we maintain, as well as offering sort of limited options with forgiving debt and other practices that we maintain. Apologies for the helicopter in the background. Hazards of doing business. But we maintain a whole set of ethical business practices that we maintain not only out of adhering to the interests of our shareholders, our customers, our employees, but because we as a company want to see ourselves as doing business rightly. Those ethical business practices are normally designed to be implemented in peacetime when you can rely on the rule of law, and you don't have any worry about your dollars funding a campaign of terror against the Ukrainian people. But most of these existing ethical business practices that we already employ can be leveraged to ensure that if we remain in Russia to do business, that we can do it in a way that is consistent with our beliefs, practices, and consistent with beliefs and practices that would not upset or alarm any of our shareholders, customers, or employees. So that includes offering limited credit forgiveness in ways that perhaps encourage or incentivize more ethical actions. So for example, we can offer some limited debt forgiveness in Ukraine in some of the most affected areas, or for the people in Russia who have managed to flee or escape, we can offer some sort of debt relief on a limited pro bono basis, as we already do for some people in very unfortunate economic circumstances here in the US or other peacetime businesses. It would also mean that just as we take steps beyond what the law requires to identify miscreants, people who are using identity theft or other unfair measures to claim to be someone they are not, or in general to try to detect criminal activities making use of our credit, even going to the extent of preempting law enforcement, we can employ those same techniques with regards to sanctions on Russian war criminals or people supporting the Russian defense industry in crucial ways, by using additional tools available to us to identify people who may be falsifying records, falsifying who they are, or using other illegal pretenses to avoid American sanctions, or even taking on the initiative to identify other people who might not have yet been identified by the American sanctions regime, but would have the potential to be in the future. For example, noting purchases that are of dual-use technologies and things that could be used to support the Russian war effort, and cutting them as individuals off from credit without needing to deprive conventional Russian consumers of access to credit.
And so when we're looking at the framework, we really want to think about what duty we have to all the people that we have already aforementioned. We have a social responsibility to, as well as our duty within this larger issue. And so we're really looking at making sure that we're taking all these various issues into account when we think about how the sanctions are making it impossible for your everyday citizen, as my partner mentioned, unable to afford just the bare minimum that they need. What do we have to that portion of our consumers to assist them, especially when they play no role in the ongoing conflict and are unable to leave Russia? And we're also thinking about what our role is as a whole when as I addressed.
Yeah, so when we apply these kind of ethical frameworks and concerns we've laid out that we feel are felt not only by us, but would be of interest to our customers, to our employees, to our shareholders, it's important we tie this directly to, again, our proposed solution. And so as we've mentioned earlier, we propose navigating this time of increased risk and uncertainty, both financial and ethical, in taking steps that we think will preserve access to credit for as many people who have a legitimate reason to access it, with minimal impact on our fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders and our obligations to continue to serve our purpose as a business and exact profit to the extent we can, by not fully removing ourselves from the Russian market as some of our competitors have, but rather remaining and using conventional business practices we already employ domestically to enhance our adherence to the sanctions regime and to identify greater numbers of people who may, in fact, need to be deprived of credit from an ethical perspective to stop people from financing or otherwise supporting the Russian war effort, and to ensure that we're using some of our already existing tools like limited debt relief to align that with our interests in supporting those who are most impacted by the war. So that would probably be primarily Ukrainians, but also some limited assistance to Russian dissidents and stuff like that. And so when we think about why we, from a purely ethical perspective, ought to adhere to this proposed solution, We need to recognize that there are some of the deontological concerns that my partner laid out, which is, are we as an individual company supposed to start setting American foreign policy unilaterally? The American Congress has reviewed a whole host of proposed financial sanctions, going actually farther than many people expected them to at the advent of the war, balancing concerns between trade restrictions, targeted sanctions against individuals, sanctions on Russian financial institutions, as well as obviously sanctions on Russian energy and exports. We don't think it is appropriate for us as a company to try to take aggressive measures that drive financial, that could potentially pressure the American government or other American organizations to take measures beyond what is seen as necessary by people who have access to far more information than we do and are answerable to the American people and to security concerns more broadly. So some of the like deontological concerns we would have about other courses of action is by taking far more dramatic stances that are removed from more legitimate elected actors would potentially put other people in uncomfortable situations, forcing them to make unethical choices or choices that they, like us, don't have legitimate basis to make. If we were to unilaterally withdraw from Russia in its entirety, that could create greater pressure on other businesses or greater pressure on politicians to put in place very dramatic financial restrictions on Russia, which if they have yet to do, that, it is likely because they have information that it could be detrimental to driving Russia out of Ukraine, or it would be a poor stewardship of the interests of their constituents. Similarly, more dramatic actions like avoiding compliance with the sanctions regime and trying to continue to do business in Russia, including with people who are targeted by American sanctions or with financial institutions that are targeted by American sanctions, as has been reportedly done in other countries, like with many American businesses seemingly continuing to do business with Iran, even using like dual use technologies. That could similarly put our competitors under a pressure to continue to do business and with targeted financial institutions and individuals out of fear of leaving that market to us to corner. So we think ethically, even though it could potentially involve leaving some money on the table, we ought to ensure that we are complying fully with sanctions as they stand and not creating any unfair financial incentives that ought to drive our competitors to make the same kind of unethical choices, even if it potentially is leaving a small amount of money on the table. And when we start to think in more consequentialist terms about the long-term outcomes of our actions, as we alluded to earlier, there's a danger that more dramatic actions like withdrawing from Russia entirely could fall victim to the Cobra effect, and it could either legitimize some of the more dramatic and incorrect claims that the Putin government has been making about the West being resolved to destroy Russia, wage war against Russian civilization, or completely destroy the Russian people in some way, which is ridiculous, but might seem less ridiculous to a Russian customer who can no longer do business in dollars or do business with an American institution they've been used to relying on for their credit card and other financial services for years potentially. And it could also cut off some of the most vulnerable people in Russia. As we alluded to earlier, the Russian government has already taken steps to start using Chinese financial services and has gone to great lengths itself to provide alternative sources of revenue. At the start of the war, had the largest reserve of foreign currency. And so we recognize that there's a real danger that who we would be robbing of basic financial and literacy would be, in fact, the people who are least beholden to the Russian government or most vulnerable to its deprivations, rather than the Russian government itself. So by most clearly targeting our ethical concerns about the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we believe that we can navigate the chaotic financial and ethical situation we are confronted with. And if the board backs our proposed solution, we can do that in a way that is both inoffensive to our shareholders, customers, and employees, has minimal impact on our overall revenue, and most importantly, serves all of our moral obligations to this challenging time. And with that, we would like to open up to questions from the board.
Okay, thank you very much. And I know the third board member, Dr. Altarane, only joined us really in the past 90 seconds or so. And so I suppose he can sort of listen in. But let me go ahead and invite our two board members to begin to ask their questions for no more than a total of 20 minutes.
So let me ask, can you hear me first of all, since I had trouble
Yes.
before? Can you just summarize what you're saying? Are you suggesting, am I hearing you correctly, that we stay in Russia and we continue to provide credit to the Russian people and basically continue to do business as we usually have while trying to follow the sanctions imposed by the United States and any of the other Western countries? Is that briefly what you're saying?
Yes, sir. It would be akin to kind of what we were doing in Russia after 2014, when we started complying with a large number of Western financial sanctions, but not doing anything. And so increasing that behavior in scale, but not changing it in kind as a result of the Russian invasion.
In light of the increasing tensions with Russia, if we continue to provide credit in the Ukraine also, which if I heard you correctly, you're saying, are we not making ourselves a target for Russia to then do something to us that might make it worse?
Yeah, so part of the challenge, especially from a practical and business perspective, is the threat of the Russian government itself penalizing us in some way, seizing assets, threatening individuals, threatening employees. As we alluded to, this has been a threat basically since the start of Vladimir Putin's third term, as Russia's become a more hazardous place to be an American, to be in business, for any of these things. So part of what we're proposing is to take a more limited and cautious approach to Russia, which would likely include having more work done remotely, keeping more people out of Russia. I think currently it's the Moscow office that would likely have been handling most of our work in Ukraine. Maybe having the key office for Ukraine be located in Poland and kind of disentangling personnel so people don't need to travel between the countries. Those kind of normal risk mitigation factors. But we have in the past been able to do business in countries that are on very negative terms with each other as part of us being a global brand.
And also my last question is, are we not, in doing this, given the pressures on the people of Russia and the decrease in the economy, are we not going to actually be extending credit to people who either, one, will probably never be able to pay it back, or will get them into enormous debt as they have to live more and more on the debt that we provide, and we end up with bad debt?
Yeah, so as we kind of somewhat briefly mentioned, there is a challenge in the quality of the debt we're issuing and kind of greater concerns about people's ability to repay it. A lot of that is just tragically related to how we do business, which is oftentimes our highest margin products tend to be those to people who are least able to pay them back. And so that hasn't fundamentally changed in Russia. A lot of how this is going to be affected is just kind of continuing to do business during a recession. But we think it's important to recognize that giving people access to credit when they need it is still really important. We have in the past in America, kind of in normal business, forgiven debts on a limited basis due to extreme need and urgency. And we thought we could potentially align that with concerns about the Russian government itself. So for example, people who are fleeing Russia because they're political dissidents or stuff like that, maybe they should have less concern about needing to repay debt they take on to get like plane tickets or something like that. But a lot of it is some of the constant uncomfortable moral challenges of doing business in a world that even under the best of circumstances is chaotic, and where people will take on debt they won't be able to repay, and we'll need to exact those repayments as best we can. But also with an understanding that there's some unique threats and challenges of the Russian war. So we'll be slightly more cautious in issuing debt. Maybe we'll have a $0.9 billion instead of $1.2 billion in revenue. But being able to target some of that normal debt forgiveness that we would normally be providing, to align it more with our concerns about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and to aid political dissidents or people who are particularly victimized by the Putin government as best we can.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Daniel, you have questions?
Yeah, I have a clarification question, I guess. You mentioned something that I just didn't hear the definition of, the Cobra effect.
Oh, yes, so that's when there's kind of unintentional consequences. I think it was the British Raj in India started offering bounties for people to kill cobras because there were too many cobras. So people started breeding cobras to bring for the bounty, which greatly increased the number of cobras in cities in India.
I understand. So how does this Cobra effect apply to the specifics of Ukraine and Russia?
So the kind of concern here would be that there would be somewhat foreseeable but unintentional and disastrous consequences to the more dramatic options we have, like a total withdrawal from Russia, namely that it would bolster a lot of Putin's claims about the nature of Western conflict with Russia, right? No country in the West, with the exception of Ukraine, is at war with Russia. No country is trying to destroy the Russian people or Russian culture or anything like that. But the concern is those claims might seem far more compelling to the Russian people if they don't have access to like bank accounts, if those bank accounts or credit cards are run by Western banks. So it would be a danger of kind of unintentionally bolstering or legitimizing the Putin administration, or perhaps of forcing kind of more dramatic action where a total withdrawal could potentially drive the government to take more radical actions, like seizing what remaining Western assets and stuff like that are in the country.
So the justification for remaining in Russia is largely precautionary, and you're concerned about propaganda abuse by Putin.
Yeah, that would have propaganda abuse, and that when we think about cutting people off from credit has negative implications for them under the best of circumstances, but that a lot of the tools and techniques Russia has used to mitigate the costs of financial challenges with the West would only be available to people who are already aligned with the Putin administration in some way. So the Russian government has massive foreign currency reserves, has taken a lot of steps to allow state-owned and state-backed industries to do business in China using non-dollar denominated exchanges and debt. And so we would in fact be kind of disproportionately harming people who are already cut off from the Putin regime, already in disfavor with the government, already financially vulnerable to it, or of course, perhaps politically critical of it.
Okay. Thank you for the explanation.
So I know, Ahmad, you didn't have a chance to hear most of the presentation, but in the time that we have, the next 12 minutes before our opportunity to ask questions, if maybe just hearing the questions of your colleagues inspires you, don't hesitate to unmute yourself and jump in. But one thing I'll ask is, do you feel good about having thought through the implications of that if we stay, those who support Ukraine and the many countries around the world who support Ukraine in this will feel that we're making a mistake, that we're doing the wrong thing, and it could influence our profits in other parts of the world because we might be formally or informally boycotted by persons and countries who support Ukraine in this conflict.
So that was actually something we discussed at length when drawing up this proposal. Ultimately, it was our feeling from a financial perspective that there would not be boycotts of financial services based off of whether or not they continued to do business in Russia. This is both because Visa and our competitors do business with countries that are already viewed more critically. So, for example, Visa, as well as our competitors like Visa, continue to do business in China, and it wasn't impacted by, say, the American State Department's recognition of the Uyghur genocide. And even in polling, Americans tend to have a more negative view of China than they do of Russia, even after the invasion of Ukraine. So we don't think that it's impacted our ability to do business in other countries that are viewed more critically. And we thought that while there are some services that are very easy to transfer between, so for example, like Burger King or McDonald's, if like only one of them was remaining in Ukraine, it's very easy for people to take their business elsewhere. But we're pretty confident what distinguishes us from our competitors, like you know, Amex, Visa, stuff like that, is not stuff are not differences that people would ignore or overlook because of their political beliefs or their views about international relations.
Okay, and have you given thought, you mentioned Crimea and obviously the current conflict. I don't know if it's been about 14 months or something like that. For all the right reasons, you support your recommendation, that we stay in. Have you thought about an escalation of the conflict, or have you thought about making a list of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 things that could happen that you believe would change your point of view? If Russia went nuclear, if we determined that Russia was using chemical warfare against Ukrainian children or something, is there anything that would be so horrible, or is there any line that would, what's an example of where a line would be crossed that you might possibly conclude that it's not the right thing to do to stay?
Well, I think there's kind of 2 elements to this question. One is we're choosing to stay not because we think like the Russian invasion is like only this bad, and if it got this bad, like that would change things. We're choosing to stay because we think that a total withdrawal of American financial services would actually probably undermine Ukraine by bolstering the Putin regime in Russia and its popularity, and would actually kind of be a negative on its own. Now, it's quite likely, and kind of the other caveat being, we don't think that us alone withdrawing from Russia would like cause such an issue with credit, would cause the financial collapse of the Russian state, forcing it to withdraw from the war or something like that. So what would change it is, one, if Russia used a nuclear weapon or chemical weapons or anything kind of extraordinarily horrific in Ukraine, it might create a political willingness or demand for like something more approaching a total economic blockade of Russia, not that targeted sanctions on individuals and industries we've seen thus far, but a much kind of far-reaching set of sanctions, which we would absolutely comply with. And if it became we were the sole financial lifeline supporting a country and allowing it to continue to do business when everyone else was abandoning it because it was so terrible, and we actually were the difference between Russia's ability to have a functioning economy or not, whether it was like us choosing to remain there was suddenly essential to the ability of Russia to have a tax base to tax to fund their war effort, of course that would change things and we would likely leave. The other thing outside of escalation in the war, where again we're remaining because we think that us withdrawing would actually bolster the Russian war effort because of the minimal economic impact, but the large kind of propaganda value, where we could see us choosing to leave, even with that understanding of the likely impact of us leaving would be to potentially bolster Putin's government, would obviously be danger to our employees or our ability to kind of safely conduct business there. We noted during our presentation some concern about there was a Wall Street Journal reporter who was seized on trumped up charges. There would be serious concern, I think, of continuing to do business if it was potentially putting our employees in danger. And already, as I think we responded to one of the earlier questions, identifying, separating out the offices from like Moscow and Kiev, keeping personnel separate, making sure that we are not putting anyone at undue risk, maximizing how much remote work is done, things like that. But there are certainly domestic changes in Russia that would change things. We didn't withdraw from like China after the recognition of a genocide, but we don't do business in North Korea because it would simply not be safe to do business there.
Okay, so Leon or Daniel, up to 5 minutes left to ask questions. Okay, Leon's okay. Anything from Daniel or Ahmad?
I guess the only clarification I would think about would be finding a balance between perhaps limiting business activity while not giving Putin propaganda material. In other words, perhaps limiting the scale of business while not exiting completely. Is that something that you've considered?
I think absolutely. In part, again, one of the things we want to do is comply with sanctions as fully as we can, not be doing anything to like try to weave our way around them. And in fact, trying to use our own normal resources around, identity theft protection and stuff like that to ensure we're adhering to them as fully as possible. Some sanctions have started to target entire sectors. So kind of any defense sector companies, people who work in the defense sector in Russia, or even frankly, dual use technology, broadly targeting that would be really important for making sure that we're doing business ethically, even if we're choosing to remain there. Like, I think while it would be important for our business from an ethical as well as from a financial perspective to remain in Russia in some capacity, I think we should be totally clear that we don't support what Russia's doing, and we don't want our financial resources to be leveraged in any way to support that. And that could mean blocking off huge chunks of the Russian economy. So before just like throwing numbers out there, like we could potentially have it like business revenue fall to like $900 million a year instead of 1.2 billion or something along those lines. That's covering a huge share of the Russian economy. That would be assuming a huge share of the Russian economy is being cut off. And that even extends to individuals. So like a lot of Russian units, due to the lack of professionalism and integrity within the Russian defense forces, a lot of units have been forced to fund themselves, relying on individuals like buying drones, buying walkie-talkies and stuff, sending to them. I think we could totally have a blanket ban on people's ability to use our credit to purchase any of those kinds of dual use technologies. And if you want to buy your kid like a Mavic drone for his birthday or something like that, we would advise against that because it might threaten your ability to have continued access to credit, because we can draw broad lines around not allowing any of our financial resources to be used to support the war in Ukraine. I think we can err on the side of potentially excluding more people from credit because they're doing actions that look like it could be supporting the war in Ukraine, even if they themselves individually are not. Like, we can assume some risk there of cutting individuals off from credit, but I think cutting the entire country of Russia off from consumer credit would be a really dramatic and dangerous action to take. And any image and the propaganda value of it, or its ability to undermine and weaken the parts of Russia that are least tied to the Putin government, is just such a bad outcome. We need to go to great lengths to avoid it. But we absolutely can try to draw a middle path, and in fact should try to do our utmost to avoid supporting the war, even if it means cutting many individuals and entire sectors of the economy off from access to consumer credit, even though we'd still be remaining in Russia as a whole.
Can I just clarify, you were talking now about supporting the war in Ukraine. From the Russian perspective, what if I'm using your credit card as a Ukrainian to buy a drone? Are you not supporting the war in either country?
I don't think we would need to go to that length. I think, in fact, I think there's kind of a clear moral difference in our eyes as individuals, but certainly we would think in the eyes of our shareholders, customers, and employees, that Ukraine's fighting a kind of righteous war of self-defense and Russia's fighting a baseless war of aggression. So while I don't think we want to be in the business of trying to say like directly purchase arms for Ukraine or anything, because that's not our business.
Yes.
there are not American sanctions in effect on anyone who has ties to the Ukrainian defense industry. We would have no reason to try to target them from a legal perspective. We certainly have no moral obligation to stop people from like purchasing a drone in Ukraine. And in fact, when we were talking about some of the ethical business practices we use in America that could be leveraged in this context, such as limited debt relief, we think we should maybe be prioritizing people in Ukraine who are most vulnerable. And when it comes to like talking about where we can offer debt relief, like maybe someone whose home was destroyed by a Russian missile or something should be very high up on that list.
Thank you.
Can I jump in? Is it possible for me to jump in for just like a few seconds, please?
Just a few seconds, go.
Yeah. Okay. So now your decision to stay and continue the business, was that also partly based on like measuring the voice of your shareholders, customers, and employees?
Yeah. So as we mentioned with some of the earlier questions, we thought very seriously about whether it would be a big concern to employees or customers that we continue to do business in Russia. And kind of the conclusion we came to was that strictly adhering to existing ethical business practices we have and trying to fully enforce sanctions regime and limit any connection between our financial resources and the Russian invasion of Ukraine would assuage moral concerns and avoid kind of any deeper, broader concerns about the consequences of our actions, and make sure that we could have, for example, employees who come to work feeling proud of the work they do every day.
So there was a formal survey for the shareholders, customers, employees?
There was not a formal survey. We would expect that a decision like this would probably be the weight of it would be felt by shareholders who are likely represented pretty adequately by yourselves.
So you're assuming, not you. So there were
Yeah,
not actual
we're assuming
voice
based off of context of other companies and similar business decisions.
All right, that's good. All right, thank you.
Well, listen, thank you to all of you. We can now step out of character, and I can be the first to congratulate Vivian and Jacob for doing such a great job for more than 45 minutes on that. And so we're in the last portion of our time, which is when we all step into our normal roles of the judges are just judges and the Vivian and Jacob are students. And let's hear some feedback. Remember that it's 1:03 Eastern time, and this conversation can last no longer than until about 1:25. But we want to make the most of this opportunity to give feedback to the students, knowing that well, first of all, that they worked very hard on this, apparently. Secondly, they're delivering their 10-minute presentation tomorrow. So any feedback that we can give them that would be a benefit to them on that front. And thirdly, they're delivering their 90-second tomorrow. And so let me invite the three judges to begin the process of giving direct, constructive, and substantive feedback to our two competitors.
So
Can
I'm
I
happy
please
to
start?
Yeah, go ahead.
If I could start, because I'm in Erbil, and basically the situation here is the electricity could get cut off any minute, and I could lose the internet connection. That's why I apologize also for being late because of that. My only concern is that the actual surveying of the voice of the customer, voice of stakeholders and shareholders, and that should be done formally, at least so they can get consensus that they have the right decision. So that I would just take that in consideration and maybe adjust accordingly.
Okay.
Excellent. Leon.
So first of all, thank you for a great presentation and taking on an extremely dicey subject and doing it very well. I would make the following observations, and you can take them for what they're worth. I would hope that you might consider them because they might make it a little better. But first, I would have liked to have heard more from Vivian. It was a fairly one-sided presentation. The other is, at least in the beginning, Jacob was cut off your picture was cut off. So you might consider when each one is talking, shifting the camera slightly so you're the one that we're
Mhm.
looking at. The other is in your slides. You had that one last slide that had ethics and had everything across it. You might think about splitting that up. And if you want to say, we're going to talk about the ethics and just have 3 bullet points: social responsibility, rights and framework or whatever. And then another slide that will expand each of those, just only because it makes things move along. But basically, this was a great presentation. I learned a lot, and am very happy that you did it, and you did it well. And congratulations. And you handled the questions well. You had an answer for everything. You are clearly well versed in the topic and have thought about all of the implications, and were able to address them. So nice job.
Thank you very much, sir.
Daniel.
I agree with everything you just said regarding just the camera cutoff and the slightly uneven distribution of who is speaking. I suppose my only feedback would be to maybe get a little bit more granular into how the ethical implications were decided, rather than sort of justifying the decision based on the momentum of other companies and sanctions and whatnot, but really diving into how, from an ethical point of view, these kinds of decisions were finalized. So it seems a little short kind of cut off to just simply say we're complying with sanctions and not doing anything that other companies aren't doing. That seems kind of a justification. And since the primary topic is ethics, how do you make that decision besides what other people are doing? So standing on your own moral ground for the decision. Obviously, what other people are doing is impactful. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay, great. And again, all of us, Ahmad and Leon and Daniel, can keep on offering more. You, Vivian and Jacob, can ask questions. Just for me to be the 4th person to weigh in. Again, overall, very good. I agree with Leon that it's crystal clear that you've thought this very deeply. Really good answers to the questions. Yeah, again, I've been judging this thing every year for over 20 years, and really impressive that you are so knowledgeable about the content, that you can answer the questions so effectively and very specifically in response to the question, instead of trying to force some information in your head as an answer when it's not exactly what we asked. So that's great. Yeah, similarly, I guess I've got a list of things to go through here, so I'm not going to say that these are in any order. I thought there was room for improvement about how to use the slides. This is a complex topic, and it's an emotional topic, and the minds of people listening and trying to process this important information you're sharing, you need to make it easy for us to organize this in our mind. And so I think there's more room for the content of your presentation, to be more directly kind of outlined on the slides, so it can help us keep track of what you're sharing and we can look at these individual slides and kind of get a big picture of it, the way that Leon said. So, so I thought there was room there. And, you know, to the extent that the last slide we saw was that ethical one, I'll tell you that, you know, my experience, it's been much more common that, you know, that is, of course, as Daniel suggested, the most important slide, because the ethical facet of all of this is the most important aspect. But I've commonly seen that as you move toward your conclusions, there'd be a slide that emphasized your recommendation, and maybe one slide that would be a conclusion or something like that. So it sort of takes the hand of the judges and walks them through the beginning, the middle, and the end of what you're sharing. And the slides are just a tool for us to keep all of this information organized. There, you know, on the ethical slide, it seems like the first two columns were center justification, but the right column was left justification. So whatever you choose, I think, should be consistent. In this competition, we discourage folks from using words like utilitarianism and deontological. It's absolutely the right thing to do for you to use the concepts, you know, the way that you did. Just don't actually say the words. So, you know, you can talk about phrases like, you know, greatest good for the greatest number, or you can talk about those substantial ethical theories, but we want it to be in such practical language that we literally will go through the entire presentation and never actually hear the word deontology or something. So I would recommend, you know, both for the 10-minute and the 90-second, do everything 99% to the same approach that you did, just don't actually use either of those words. My notes show I was really impressed with the ethical analysis, you know, of whether or not staying, you know, helps actually helps the Russian government or not. So it's a very positive inclusion in your content for you to have thought in advance what people who disagree with you would say, and you counter that. So that was excellent, because it was a well-rounded analysis to say, hey, there are pluses and minuses, and we understand that there's no path forward that has only advantages and no disadvantages, and you acknowledge the key disadvantages and why you still chose this solution. That's an excellent way to, you know, get an A on a paper that I'm going to grade. I agree with Leon that by the second half, we could see most of Jacob, but there were too many minutes at the beginning when Jacob was saying fabulous things, but not enough of his head was in the frame. The imbalance between the number of minutes that Vivian spoke and Jacob spoke was very noticeable. Again, if for whatever reason, you know, Jacob had a lot of the information and that there might have been a reason behind, because you delivered for 25 minutes, Jacob was 21, Vivian was 4. So again, I'm sure however you're going to present 10-minute is fine or something, but if we're lucky enough to see you or West Point in the future, I think us as judges, it's a natural thing when we see the two of you to expect more of a balance among the two of you. Yeah, the fact that you delivered for 25 minutes is fantastic. So as you know, it's designed to be 25. It's perfectly welcome and acceptable for you to go up to 30. Going past 30 is bad. But I've also seen teams kind of finish at 17, and I was sad and I frowned because I wanted to hear more, and I gave them many, many more minutes to speak, but they they ran out of content, and they often didn't win the competition because there were other teams that went 25 and we got more substantial information. So good for that. And yeah, that's what I've got. Leon or Daniel, or well, first of all, let me stop and do Vivian or Jacob, do you have any questions? Do you have any rebuttals to our points? Or any questions at all? Because again, this is all about the process of you learning from this experience and the process of you being as well prepared for tomorrow as you can be. So I don't know if you have any anything to ask us. It's okay if you don't, but if you do. I don't hear Vivian's voice.
When you say that we should like formally survey the voice, what might be a good way to kind of approach that? I think-
You mean Ahmad's point?
Yes.
Are you there, Ahmad?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yeah, can you, Vivian is asking, give more specifics about what you would envision about them surveying the employees.
Yeah, what I mean there is, we're talking about making ethical decisions. So of course you have some basis and foundational issues there that you deal with on the basics of ethics. But then again, these things should be shared with your shareholders and customers. And I would say, in my opinion, a formal survey to survey the voice of the opinions of the shareholders and stakeholders and definitely customers, whether you should stay or not stay. At least that would have given you some more indication, more input to solidify your decision. Another way we could have done that is that basically sometimes in project management, we do what we call a benefit realization matrix. And so, if you consider this, to be a venture and you're there to achieve some things. So basically what you do is you undertake doing a matrix of trying to sort of like tally the benefits against the decision. So you do what we call a benefit realization matrix. Those two things, I believe, would have been very strong tools in terms of you winning this competition.
Thank you.
And then, gentlemen, just one kind of other question. Thank you again for the feedback, which we have pretty extensive notes on. I think it's very valuable. For the feedback you've offered, I know we'll scrub our presentation for tomorrow to make sure there's no 6-syllable words to be found only in philosophy textbooks. But beyond that, are there any other specific concerns you think that we should highlight? Any specific concerns about this you think you would want to flag for us when we're just thinking about how we might want to modify or make any last minute adjustments to our presentation for tomorrow? Kind of about like the specific ethical components of our argument or anything like that.
Well, I'll
Well-
just go ahead, Leon. You go
No,
first.
thank you. I was going to say, one that has to obviously be trimmed quite a bit. So you really want to, I would think, try and focus on how to set it up in a way that says, here's what we're going to tell you. We're telling you, here's what we told you. And for me, what came out of this, at least as I heard it, was you were making the point that the ethical basis for this decision was to do as little harm to the people who are most vulnerable without aiding the people who are doing harm to the rest of the world, and by staying within the context of the laws of our country and international law. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, sir.
And so you just sort of, in one way, that almost becomes your 30-second presentation. We think we should say, because if we don't, it's going to hurt the people of Russia without benefiting the oligarchy of Russia, while we stay within the laws as described by our country and international law. And we think it's best for the corporation and its ultimate survival. At least that's what I heard. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Leon. I mean, you've heard me more than once say I think it's in your best interest tomorrow that for the 10-minute, see if you can practice between now and then so that you deliver something that's more than 9 minutes, but does not go over 10. I think that's a factor for the judges. We want as much of the depth and complexity as we can get from you, but obviously there's a limit on the time. And obviously on the 90-second one, it's the same thing. Find a way if you can prepare and practice so that you definitely have more than 80 seconds, but do not go over into 90. As you know, for the 10-minute, it's only about the ethical facet. So, there will be no one expecting to grade you about the business facet or, the financial facet or the legal facet, even though Leon just made a great point, that there's ethical content into WISA deciding, to honor sanctions law and choose not to violate the law. So it's okay there. And so your approach is perfect. You are explaining exactly what Leon said, but you're explaining this is what we should do, and this is why. And the why, you're using ethical concepts, again, the way that you already delivered it and the way that Leon just summarized. You're using ethical reasoning for why it's the right thing to do. And you're right, you don't actually use the word utilitarianism or deontology, but you absolutely say, this is what we should do, and this is why. And this is why we think, in the context of everything we have to consider, including money, profit, and the safety of our employees and our legal responsibilities, we believe that this is what we should do, and these are sort of the ethical reasons why, and have that go right up until the 10 minutes. So anything else from Daniel or Ahmad before we wrap things up with our team?
I would just
I'm
add
good.
go ahead.
And I said, I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add my compliments to the depth of thought that you obviously have put into this, and my recommendations were to emphasize the granular details of the ethics, and maybe come up with a paradigm or an example of a citizen of Russia, a citizen of Ukraine, and how your dissecting of the direction of the company would impact those individuals or families in those locations that might serve as a tool.
Good. And actually, Daniel made me realize, one of the positive things is at 12:27, there was a moment when you talked about us acting consistently with our values, which is a very positive thing to say, from virtue ethics. You might even consider the possibility of listing the values on the slide, and so if you're reasoning that this is why we should do this, and if one of the reasons why comes from virtue ethics, then again, this is up to you. You don't have to do this, but if you do talk about us acting consistent with our values, which is a great thing for a company to do, it might actually help. And of course, you're allowed to make up the values because we're making up the company. So, Roberto, I don't know if there's anything you and Jacob or Vivian want to say before we ask you to go off and celebrate.
No, we just wanted to. I don't have anything to say. I just wanted to thank the judges for your time. I know these things are always, they involve quite a bit of logistical planning. So We always greatly appreciate any type of feedback that you can, plus also spending the time with us. I know that the perspective you guys provide, each of you respectively, means a great deal to the cadets for everything that they do. So thank you so much for your time.
Our pleasure. And are we good, Vivian and Jacob?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, it was very
Perfect.
generous of you all to spend.
Thank you for
especially with the students
participating.
in Mobile.
Well, listen, good luck tomorrow. Congratulations on this going so well. And all right, I bid you adieu, and I'll ask the judges to stay.